Welcome back. We hope that you enjoyed the sessions and the break. Up next is a panel on the impact of disinformation on societies and alliances, moderated by Major Jessica Dawson from the Army Cyber Institute at West Point. Please, Jessica, the stage is all yours.
Good evening. I'm excited to be here and introduce our panel on disinformation. We know that disinformation and deception have always been part of military operations, but recently, with the scale and speed of social media pouring an accelerant on an already burning flame, disinformation has created an underlying existential crisis, not but just for militaries, but for alliances, and more broadly, the societies that form the basis of these alliances. This panel will discuss the impact of disinformation on these alliances, on public conceptions of trust and military operations, as well as to discuss proposed solutions. Our panelists are a diverse group of individuals from a variety of backgrounds. Ms. Lydia Snyder is the Special Assistant to Lieutenant General Fogarty at the Army Cyber Center at Fort Gordon and advises him on the social media disinformation environment and information operations more broadly. Professor Dana Weinberg is a professor of sociology and data science at Queens College City University of New York and the director of the New War Research Consortium, which focuses on the role of narratives in disinformation. And last but definitely not least, Mr. Jānis Sārts, the director of the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, which has been on the front lines of the information war since its most recent inception in the online world. Since the disinformation wars have been heating up with governments using disinformation to control their own populations, as well as sow discord abroad, I'd like each of the panelists to start by telling us what they see as the main challenge of disinformation. Please tell us a little bit of how you view the disinformation problem and tell us something unique that we might not have thought about. Lydia, would you start us off?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and thank you everyone for being here today. I think the fundamental problem with the fundamental challenge with mis and disinformation is actually just humanity. We've had this problem since I think, probably invented language. If you look back at history, the Salem witch trials, that was mis and disinformation issue. The fact that Iceland and Greenland are named as they are was an effort to get people, to keep people from going from one going to the other. The fact that we think that Napoleon was short, he was actually 5'7", that was actually a long campaign run to try to discredit him. So this has been a component of the human experience. The thing that makes it the particular challenge now is our technology, is the connectivity, the fact that those incidents and the way it used to be was little ponds, right? It was sort of in a village, in a region, more confined. Now, with our technology, it can spread worldwide very quickly. And the other challenge with it is that another component of the factor of human, the feature of it as a human, just a component of humanity, is that it is profitable. The Macedonian kids figured that out pretty early when they were creating their articles just to get clicks. The interesting mis and disinformation were the ones that were profitable. They used to say that a lie gets around the world before the truth gets her boots on, but now it's the lie does 3 laps and becomes a conspiracy theory before truth has even gotten her feet on the ground. So it's humans. We've always done this. Our technology has expanded it. It is profitable. And now the technology is designed to continue to spread what is profitable. And unfortunately, mis and disinformation is, right? So humans are going to come up with this stuff. The technology helps spread it and helps actually corral people into it even more. So it's a complex challenge of just humans, and then we created technology that really accelerates it. The thing that surprised me when I first started in this space was that Edward Bernays, some people on this conference may know that name. If you don't, it's really interesting to go take a look at it. he actually was both the father of psyops and of marketing. And they run on very similar techniques. And I'm coming from the marketing world, and I learned the techniques through marketing. It takes 8 to 10 touches to move someone's opinion and to move them to the action that you want. Saturate their world with their message. Figure out what keeps them up at 3 a.m. and message to that. And then I discovered psyops, and oh gosh, they do the same thing. And what happened was he actually invented these concepts in World War I. And then after the war, he needed a job. So he did his book called Propaganda, which is very similar to Machiavelli's book, and that it was a job. It was a resume. So he was helping American companies understand the value of communicating to the masses the messaging that you want. And if you look at the original large companies of America, Procter & Gamble, GE, General Motors, they were all his first clients. And you can really see the effectiveness of it. And as I took a look at it, I realized marketers, we have been running information operations campaigns on the general human population. PsyOpers did it militarily. And meanwhile, marketing has been using, the whole of humanity, whole of society as a test, as the test lab. And what happened with social media, and I'm coming from that world, is what ended up happening was an accelerated test lab where you can do A/B testing in a short amount of time, and you can find out what worked, what didn't work, and you can quickly alter your messaging to make it more effective. And what we ended up having was a laboratory to really be able to hone and create like ultimate information weaponry and really take how to manipulate human perception to the next level. So I highly recommend studying Bernays and starting to study marketing books because the two converge. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you point out that this is just one giant lab, right? Chris Wiley says when they were building some of the foundational work at Cambridge Analytica, they were trying to build, society in silico, right? They wanted to replicate society in silicon and do testing, and they realized they didn't have to replicate anything. They had direct access to everyone, with all of the information that we voluntarily offer up. Dana, would you tell us what you think about, like, where do you see the main issues with disinformation?
Some of the wording, takes us off track in a lot of ways, I think. We started off worrying about misinformation and disinformation and this idea that, facts were coming out that weren't the right facts or that were not facts that were favorable to different groups for whatever reason. And I think when we look in this space, what we're really seeing more than this question of, what is the information that should be out there and what are the motives of the people behind it, is this set of influence operations that go much, much deeper. Building on what Lydia has said about the technology and the marketing techniques, our team has been working on really trying to understand the mechanisms of what makes some of these messages so sticky. What is it that really grabs onto people, kind of going back to her idea of what keeps you up at 3 a.m. And we've been looking at social narratives as part of what's going on in this space. So our whole idea is that, and I guess this would be the surprising thing, that these pieces of information, whatever they are, whatever is motivating them, when they're attached to certain kinds of social stories that get at our core values, have this emotional resonance for us. And what's been happening in the misinformation and disinformation space is that there's been this huge play on emotions through these narratives. And when it starts to happen, it threatens our sense of identity and it threatens our sense of tribe. And so all of a sudden we become very emotionally activated and our rational minds start to shut off. And now all of a sudden we're actually not talking about facts or truth or persuasion in the sort of more common ways of thinking about it. Now we're interpreting things through the lens of our sense of what groups we belong to in our identity. And so if you think about the way that this operates, these narratives, these social stories that build on big schisms in these different societies, certainly in the American context, the narratives that are being used effectively will look a little bit different than they would in another country. And yet the mechanism, we believe, is the same. That you take a narrative, for example, in America of government betrayal, which came out for some groups of the civil rights movement and for others came out of Vietnam. Those things come together. And you start to then layer different things on them, these ideas about a corrupt government. And now you're talking about stolen elections, or you're talking about a COVID hoax or something else. And it has so much more power because it dives into this very deeply held story. And the other piece of this is that once that happens, not only can you use these narratives to start to pull people into conversations or even to twist the narratives to turn them against certain groups, defining who the in-groups and the out-groups are, but you can also use them to draw the boundaries around groups. So if you take different social divisions that were already lurking underneath the surface, these narratives give you a chance to call them up, to maybe redraw them or reinforce them, and to make the group feel both, collectively identified, solid with each other, but then also a sense of threat from outside. And in the misinformation and disinformation space, what becomes so complicated then is when you want to counter the information that's out there that isn't in line with the agenda. And if you go into a counter narrative, in some ways, you end up making the groups dig in their heels, because it doesn't matter whether what you're saying is truth or not. You're all of a sudden hitting this boundary that's there. So, to think about these in different ways, when we want to think about alliances or we want to think about how do we deal with polarization, some of it is really getting on top of these narratives and using them to draw these larger boundaries around us and them.
Dana, that was really, really insightful in terms of thinking about, how you built off of what Lydia said about the marketing and how basically we're using disinformation marketing to build these tribal boundaries in a lot of ways, and to weaponize a lot of what the sort of more banal things that Lydia was talking about. Jānis, your take on this?
Well, I think first and foremost, I agree with both previous speakers, but I'll probably have a slightly different angle to the issue. And first and foremost, from a societal perspective, democracy is an intricate process. It takes a lot of elements to fall together to make sure that we have a functioning democracy. And it happens that the information space is basically the central element of that process, because that's where we build our perceptions, that's where we create our worldviews, that's where we create consensuses. And as we speak, we are undergoing the revolution in that information space, namely through social media, through online digital engagement, and etc. And in my view, what has happened in that process of revolutionization, of this is that we've lost a lot of elements that make the process of societal debate, societal discussion healthy, because unlike the traditional media space, which has checks and balances and regulation, I would argue this new space doesn't have none of that. And in a way, we're very much at the mercy of the many of the social media business models, which prioritize, obviously, engagement and emotions rather than fact-based approach. But also, they really don't look at how much they would be spending on dealing with the hostile activities on their platforms. And, with all due respect to the platforms' activity in the online environment and great declarations of how they're dealing with the hostile influence campaigns, our research points to the fact that much more needs to be done than currently. That's first thing. Second thing, obviously, yes, human has always been fallible, and we've always had these biases, and it has been hard for us to create an objective point of view or objective worldview. And that was kind of over the decades and centuries where we were evolving in our social systems. We try to kind of make people more rational, more the Enlightenment type people. But what we have right now with the increased use of technology is that technology is actually quite good at tricking people in their biases into certain beliefs. And that is what I'm really worried about down the road, is that this equation of human biases versus the technological development and the way technology can, I would say, manipulate based on these elements, human behavior, is something we have to worry down the road. But within that landscape, what I would argue, it's basically a dream landscape for the disinformation actors, be it for profit, be it different interest groups that are ready to divert to disinformation as their means of getting influence, or ultimately the state actors. And that's why I think this combination of two factors, the revolution of the information space we're facing and the issues because of that within our societies, and the exploitation of these vulnerabilities by hostile actors, is the kind of reason where we are in a situation like we are. And sometimes it's hard to tell where the kind of objective element of a new reality ends and where the activity of a hostile actor starts. And sometimes they're hostile actors in particular trying to really kind of hide themselves into the norm, into what we would call a social and societal processes that are happening within this new information space.
So I think you bring up a really, really good point, particularly with related. There's a couple of things that I want to come back to on that, but particularly where you talk about, these hostile actors hiding inside of the societal processes. One of the things that Dana and I have found as we were working on some of the Russian disinformation was the way that they very much pretended to be actors on the right and on the left in the American social media space. Dana, did you want to say a little bit more about how they used deception to kind of help us tell stories that drove us further apart?
Sure. Yeah. So the Russians are really masters at this in a lot of ways, coming at this out of the Soviet manipulative context and then bringing them to social media. And so when we started to look at narratives, we found that there was a lot that they were doing there, both in terms of how they were telling stories, but then also in terms of how they were pretending to be certain kinds of storytellers. So I'll just use the example of the military for this, because I know that's one of the topics that we're interested in on this panel. But if you look at the words that they used in their posts and in their profiles, the Russians in their disinformation campaign or their influence operation campaign rather on Twitter in English had 12.9% of their tweets and coming from either messages that had military keywords in them or came from profiles that had military keywords in them. So on the one hand, when we started to look at this, you would see that they would use narratives related to the military to give more credence to certain things that they were saying, to hide, as Jānis said, within these societal processes, and give this sense that what they were talking about was patriotic, that it was serious, that it was legitimate. And then they would use the narratives that were related to the military to, smear certain candidates in campaigns or to give halos to others. They weaponized them against different groups. In this case, it was the Muslims, the mainstream media, liberals, and the government itself. And on the other side of it, they would have these military profiles. And the military profiles didn't always use the military narratives that we saw, but they were extremely vitriolic for Twitter in their content. Twitter is such a mainstream platform that people are, even though there's a lot that goes on there, it's a little bit more tame and polite than when you go into the more private chat rooms and the more fringe groups. And so even there, you had these military folks, right? And here in this country, the military is one of our most trusted institutions. And you had than seeming representatives, service members and veterans or family members of those folks. Again, all fake profiles, telling us stories that would turn us against certain groups and would seem more legitimate because they were coming from these perceived heroes.
I think that's a really fascinating idea to use the military to weaponize against elements of the government. Lydia, to come back to you, and how have you seen the military be used, or the military rather struggle in this space that we've been talking about, right? Because the militaries of the West are part and parcel of democracy, as Jānis pointed out, right? And this is a complicated process that the military is a part of in some ways. Where have you seen the military really struggle in this space?
So for the U.S. military, one of the biggest struggles is that despite what a lot of Twitter accounts might be trying to say, we actually do have very strong respect and for the boundaries of, we do not look at U.S. persons, we do not analyze we don't engage and look at U.S. persons' social media or anything like that. And the adversaries know that, and they are in there, and they are pretending to be us. And so it's a real challenge for us that we can't look at ourselves in this way, because those Russian and those other adversary accounts are mixed in with real Americans. So they know that that's a seam, right? They know that that's a spot that we can't look. And so they jump right in there. We have the other challenge too. General Nakasone ended up creating an official Twitter account because there were so many fake accounts out there pretending to be him, not just from state actors, but from other opportunistic actors. So imitation accounts, targeting U.S. military personnel. That's one of our biggest challenges, I think, is that we are limited on how we can look at ourselves. And we know that they're in there, and we know that they're doing it. And we know that they're targeting, and they're trying to turn, like the example, right? They're trying to actually turn U.S. military personnel to not trust the military, to not trust the government. And if they can succeed in that will definitely be a large problem for us. So I think those are the main ones at this point.
Thanks, Jānis. I think when we listen to what Lydia and Dana have talked about in terms of these stories, right? And as you've pointed out, we've spent the last 500 years or so trying to be more rational and trying to participate in this thing called the Enlightenment. In many ways, it almost feels like we're moving into a digital dark age. What are some of the things that you've seen that give you hope in this space, right? So you're obviously looking at this from a conglomerate of nations, right, as part of the NATO alliances. Where do you see that we've got some signs of hope that we're starting to get our arms around this problem set and we're starting to really start leading better in this space and being more effective?
I think, yes, there is hope, but temperate hope, let's put it this way. So in the way we see it, of course, there are two areas where nations start to really invest: is the resilience of society, also pointing to the resilience of a military, but certainly you cannot, in this particular case, kind of put military out of the general society resilience. Both have to be resilient. That's one part. And second, I think there's an increased understanding that the way we are running our own information space, the way we're asking what we are asking from social media companies is not sufficient. And there needs to be more of a kind of regulatory framework. By the way, they hold the keys to our agora of democratic process. And as one of the key principles of democracy, the ones who have power have to have some transparency, accountability, and oversight. And that's something also that I see both in the EU, but I'm increasingly hearing also from the United States, there's an increased interest in that. But I'm worried. I'm worried because right now we're trying to fix the problem that we're having right now, the problem that we had yesterday. And as we all know, technology is moving fast, really. And for instance, one thing we 2 years ago run an experiment with the Latvian forces where we were the so-called red team. Well, the concept was we had to identify only in the online environment who are participating soldiers, scrape for open source big data on them, and then based on that big data, try to impact their behaviors. And we ended up being able to make soldiers disobey orders, make them, reveal their positions within the exercise scenarios, etc., etc. And that is actually, in my mind, pointing to the future problems. It's not only kind of individual tete-a-tete with some troll or imposter from Russia or Iran that soldiers will be encountering, but increasingly that would be automated systems. And I think also the risks coming from the big data we're emitting is significant, especially if you combine it with a micro-targeting, not for a political purpose or from a political standpoint, but from a hostile influence perspective. And there will be many other issues that I think technology is about to bring to our table, deepfakes and et cetera, that will once again test our limits of our capability to respond.
I'm really glad to hear you bring up the micro-targeting and the big data problem. That's something that I know that Lydia and Dana and I have all been really working hard to get the U.S. military to take seriously as a national security threat. When we think about, a lot of the things that have come up here really are getting at the profit model, the underlying profit model of these social media companies. Does anyone think, and I want to leave this one kind of open to whoever would like to jump in, does anybody think that reining in the profit model would help in this space? If we were to disincentivize the profit being made from the disinformation space, if we were to disincentivize the rapid spread of ideas like we're seeing, would changing the profit model and the profit calculus for these companies have an impact there?
I can hit it I have a different angle on this. But so not only are the social media companies profiting, but there's a whole gig economy of influence. So, if you're an influencer, sometimes it's about the status and the prestige, but a lot more of it is about the merchandise, the clicks, the views, the advertising capabilities. And so, part and parcel with the money motives that are out there for the social media companies to propagate these messages, to make their platforms places where the data can be used and where the algorithms can push certain things, especially from a marketing perspective, if you think about these influence operations as a marketing exercise. That's still there. But then you also have an army of individuals, sometimes networked ones, sometimes working solo, who are also benefiting in a variety of social and economic ways from, spreading these engaging messages, oftentimes the ones that create outrage and upset.
I think that's a really, really good point of all of the different folks that are benefiting from this current model. Did someone else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, this is sort of, I'm going to go ahead a little bit to how to try to solve this. Right, it makes money. If it makes money, people are going to do it. And, if you remember from the early days of the internet, right, what was the first rule of the internet was don't feed the trolls. And that's where we are, is we are feeding the trolls. And it's not just the nasty little Gamergate comment trolls, which is where that started, but it's all of the trolls. It's the people who are tweeting out content, whether they believe it or not, they're tweeting it out for the response. And if we could, as collectively as humans, stop feeding the trolls, stop responding to that, then that's the way you would incentivize it. That's the way you would take the money out of it. That's the way you would pull the profit out. How do you get people to do that? I sit there and I watch these things go, and I think everyone just remember the first rule. And I think the way that we get at that, I think I froze. There we go. The way we get at that is it's going to take grassroots, much more individual, engaging with people more personally effort. If I had not gotten this job, the thing that I would have been out there doing was building my network of influence ambassadors, but not for money, but for teaching mis and disinformation tactics and what is happening. So not everybody is going to want to hear from me about how the Russians are putting information into their information stream. The key is to go find the person from that tribe, from that group, who will listen and will understand and who will go then teach their tribe. It's going to much more take connecting with people individually, you know, putting out Snopes articles, people just, they're already inoculized against those. I think what we need to do is we need to start figuring out how to start building the tribes of mis and disinformation debunkers. And I'll hand it over.
Jānis?
Yeah, well, first, we run a system that tracks Russian social media botnets. And over the years, and it's been a year since we've been doing so, so you kind of start establishing the who they're answering to and the command control arrangements. But what we've always find surprising that almost all of those systems also run a commercial enterprise. That means that 70 to 90% of the time, they actually sell their manipulation services to whoever is ready to buy. And I think that's an interesting thought that some Russian state actors that are developing these systems and fielding them in particular to advance their interests and harm ours and our societies, on the side make quite a lot of money just by also selling it. And I think it's quite a paradox. And of course, therefore, my answer is yes, we have to deal with that. I also agree with Lydia. We have to look at the kind of humans being and doing more. But in this part of the region, there's actually quite a lot of kind of activity on a societal level, so-called elves, the groups, non-governmental groups that self-organize to fight trolls and et cetera, et cetera. But I have to say, after seeing these phenomena for like 4 or 5 years, it has a place, but it's limited. We, I think, have to address wider problems, including, as I've said, regulation of social media, being able to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do, to root out, for instance, these inauthentic behavior bot systems, to spend their kind of abundant money also in the ways to protect the consumers that are online. That's first. Second, which is, I think, a fundamental discussion to be had, but I think we're going to have it. Who is supposed to own data? And I know there have been quite a lot of discussions, but coming from a security perspective, I find that the current practice is not quite good. I understand how it might fundamentally change many business models, but I think that is something worth debating.
Yeah, I think you bring up an excellent point about the fundamental ownership of data, right? So in the United States, we have this idea of copyright that the minute you put something into a physical medium, you own the rights to it. Well, when we start thinking about people's data and all of the ways that that can be used to manipulate individuals, right? It really raises a much bigger question about the ownership of this. Who does actually own this, right? When we think about medical data, when we think about mental health records, when we think about blood types and like all of the folks that went and did the blood typing to get their genomic history, right? Like all of that data now are owned by other companies, by private companies. And we know that some of our adversaries are eagerly either hacking their way into this or buying it. And just because it's not a threat now doesn't mean that it won't necessarily be a threat in the future. Jānis, can you say a little bit more about what you would like to see in terms of regulation in this space? Because I think you're absolutely right that we can't count on companies' goodwill because their primary directive is to make a profit, right? And just telling them, hey, be good citizens clearly isn't working. So What would you like to see in terms of regulation? And then Lydia and Dana, I'd like you to speak to that too as well.
Before that regulation, just a short point. We just had an experimentation on big data brokers, and I have to say that you can buy anything you wish for, and it's like so detailed, especially for the US citizens not covered by GDPR and having a large data broker market. It horrified me, at least. Okay, so
We're
now on
about that after.
Yeah, on the regulatory point, I do believe the three principles that we have to ask from the social media. A is transparency to a regulator on algorithms to make sure that they are not unnecessarily prioritizing A, B, or C things, and actually ability to go in and have an independent view of it. Second, obviously, is that we have to be able to independently review their security practices. As I've said, we've come a number of times in the situations where, for instance, companies say one thing, saying, well, we're doing a great job to take down so many botnets on their platforms. And then when we run an experiment, we go to those shady dealers, buy their services, and try it out on our own accounts in Facebook and see, well, it's cheap, easily accessible. You basically Google search for the provider and you get it. So there's really kind of need to have an independent ability to check, and if it's not providing, have a good, hefty penalty. And ultimately, as I've said, in my view, also the data ownership issue has to be reviewed, because it leads, I think, down the road to very, very significant problems. And of course, we're right now talking of the world where most of that is a Western product companies. But as we know, increasingly Chinese products like WeChat, TikTok are coming in, and then on the back end there's a Chinese social credit system model somewhere running probably certain things. So it's, I think, an absolute last moment we start to talk about it.
I think you bring up absolutely excellent points, and I agree with all three of your regulatory proposals. Dana, what would you propose?
I mean, I think the only thing that I would add to that is this idea of a right to privacy, that, you know, right now, all of our information is seen as a commodity rather than as something that is integrally part of our identities, and that, you know, we have a right to keep private. And with all of the information that's out there already, as you've already noted, there's already a significant risk to anybody who's engaged with these systems. You know, even the credit card companies have data on, in the US, 98% of our households. So even putting the genie back in the bottle, I think, is going to be a very difficult thing. And it's going to take some sustained work over, you know, quite a period of time to really prioritize this idea that we do have the rights to take our information, to be private about it, and to not have it be sold for profit.
I think that's an excellent point. Chris Wiley makes an outstanding point about privacy, you know, being fundamentally related to human agency in his book that I don't want to say the title in polite company, but it's an absolutely excellent book, Mind F. Lydia, what would you recommend in terms of regulatory oversight?
I agree with all of this, and then I would say that the sites need to come with a warning label like cigarettes. So the next part is, when Cambridge Analytica broke, I was really excited because I'd been tracking that, and I'd been the crazy person on Facebook saying, stop taking these quizzes you're giving, right? And I was excited because I thought it was going to be explained and people would understand. And what people took away from that in my world was Facebook is collecting data on me, you know, and I'm excited that at that point, people in my world got the concept of, if you're not paying, you're the product, which a lot of people seem to have also forgotten now. I think that there needs to be more warnings throughout the tools, throughout the sites of, you know, like the cigarette warnings. That's what I would say. Let's get some warnings on there so people can start to think and realize the tools that they're using and what it is doing along the way.
I think those are all really, really excellent recommendations across the board. I would add two, if I may be so bold as to jump in. One, I would like to see universities change their IRB rules to enable research using all of this data that are out there. Right now, a lot of the universities will push back on projects because it's people's data that they didn't necessarily consent to being collected. And yet research universities are some of the only folks that have the capability to provide some of the oversight and the investigation of how these tools are working. And the other thing that I would propose is advertiser registration, right? So right now, anybody with a credit card can log on to any of these platforms and start buying advertisements. If we were to require advertisers to get, to register with a government agency like, here in the United States, the federal, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, then these platforms would know that the person that was advertising was a known entity as opposed to an unknown entity. I don't think that the social media platforms will ever go for that. But I think it would be a really interesting way of splitting the difference in terms of still allowing advertising, but providing some regulatory oversight there. I want to come back to one more point that we were kind of talking about and draw the lens up a little bit higher in terms of alliances, right? We've really talked about democracy, and we've really talked about the stories that get told inside of society and the profit model here. Where do we see the challenge of alliances and being able to maintain, this thing called democracy requires trust. It requires knowing that the person working in your government is actually working, somebody that and that they're, you assume that they're doing the right thing. In the American narratives, the stabbed in the back narratives, right? It's this very anti-Semitic conspiracy that the government has been taken over and it's working to enslave the American people, right? So you can't have a democracy if you don't believe that your government is part of the democratic process. So when we think about alliances and we think about democracy more broadly, how do we see alliances coming together to influence this? Because right now, the regulatory process is sort of state by state in many ways in America. And I know the EU has a little bit more of a collective effort here, but where do we see, NATO really working with the alliance factor to try and combat this? So Jānis, if you could start us there.
Well, clearly, from a NATO's perspective, we're looking at the security implications for that, and the security implications are pretty wide. We're talking not only of military or military operations. We're talking about the society implications. You might be having an excellent military operation, but you might be targeted by the hostile actor within your home country and ruin all the success of a military operation. And it is a very likely scenario that we might have in the near future. So I think it's first and foremost the kind of, from NATO's perspective, to raise the security perspective, the urgency. But clearly NATO doesn't have the many tools to work with that, although one thing that we've learned in our center is that you have to show real life examples that people can relate to. And for instance, this experiment that we run with the soldiers, it's news about that spread in the forces like a wildfire. And, soldiers almost like drop their phones because of that. So it is through example that NATO can give these guidances. But by and large, I think there are basically two entities that can do something about it at this point in time. It's either EU or United States as a country. And the best, if it can be done more or less jointly, because that's where we can set the key parameters, how this should function in a modern 21st century democracy and keep the freedoms and values, but not allow this disinformation and fracturing of a society as we're seeing right now. So that's where I see that alliance, and we as a center have been continuously talking both to EU Parliament as well as US Senate on these issues to just raise the flag of the risks we're running if we're not fixing it today.
I think that's a really, really, really great point. Lydia.
I mean, I think one of our biggest obstacles right now is political will, because the purveyors of the mis and disinformation have done such a fabulous job of creating ways to undermine this. When Jānis was talking before, he was talking about how debate and discussion have been undermined in our world now. And if you look at it, right, if someone comes in with a differing opinion, or if someone suffers the consequences for saying outrageous things, they cry cancel culture, I'm canceled. So I think we need our leaders to be brave and take the risk and be ready to take the troll and the real person onslaught, and dare to do this alliance and do this work. It's going to be a hard fight, because those that are trying to keep that from happening have actually already built up a really effective system as far as ideas and language, and being able to rope people in to undermine it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, in a lot of different ways, and it's quite disheartening, because we're sort of trying to push the snowball, push the avalanche back uphill, if you will. Dana?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add, but I think that the pandemic puts a lot of this in perspective as well. This need for getting ahead, an information advantage in the information and disinformation space, and one that really recognizes that while we do have our national boundaries and our, traditional alliances, that a lot of the things that are happening in the world really transcend that. And so it's really imperative that different governments work together and, try to work on what's happening in this space. And so, if one country regulates but the others don't, we have this sort of whack-a-mole problem where we might be able to contain something just a little bit, but our communications are so far beyond, these boundaries.
I think that's a really, really excellent point. And thinking about boundaries, we actually have a couple of questions from the audience. One of them is actually really about boundaries, about professional standards, right? So it says, for a good portion of human history, there really hasn't been a professional news industry with editorial standards. It really did develop in the sort of early parts of the 20th century. Do we think it's realistic for us to expect that we can return to a professionalization, or to any kind of professionalization in the social media space, or in the media space more broadly? Lydia?
I have a dream. So where we are right now with a lot of our media space is, right, they've learned, I'm off camera here. They've learned that, right, we're playing gladiator games on our evening news, right? It's the fight for the best soundbite. The thing that I've seen, there's another person who does in-depth dives on content and information. Unfortunately, he's very biased in a certain take, and he generally goes vulgar, so I can't share it a lot. However, I would not be surprised if news decided to try some of these deep dives and go into the information. I think they would be very surprised at how hungry people are for something besides the sound bites. I think that maybe the way we get to it is just the natural evolution of people are tired. They get tired of this, and they want more in-depth information. And if someone would dare to take the risk to do well-researched, in-depth, well-produced reports, I think they would be really surprised. And yeah, how do we solve this? I think we're in a cycle, and I think that we're going to have to hit a harder rock bottom before we come back to our age of digital enlightenment, it seems.
Yeah. Anyone else want to tackle that one? We have a couple more questions. Go ahead.
If I may just quickly, first, of course, you have to recognize US space, and I would argue also UK spaces are particular. If you look at many other nations, there are more central ground in that information space, and still more of a quality kind of information available. But what we have in the smaller information spaces, these media business models are dying out. In smaller countries like Latvia, for instance, is almost dead, and it's starting to go into other bigger language spaces. And that is also because most of their ad revenue goes to the large social media companies. So that's one part of the problem. The second, of course, there's no way to turn back. But of course, you could think of theoretical models where some of the editorial choices and decisions can be given out to tech.
Yeah, I mean, the question of editorial is really, really interesting. And tech likes in America, they like to say that, they're not content, editors, they're just platforms. But yet with their algorithms, we know that their algorithms are built to make choices about what content that they're going to advance versus not. So I think that reframing the idea of what does it mean to be a content publisher or editorial and looking at the role of algorithms in that, I think is a really, really interesting point. Another question that's come up is there any, we've talked a lot of defense here. Do we have any ideas that folks would like to share about offensive tactics that we've seen maybe work? Who is doing a good job in some of these spaces? Is anyone?
Well, if I may,
you go.
Sorry, Lydia, you go.
You go first. I'll go ahead.
Okay. Well, actually, since Russia is about 200 kilometers from here, we've been tracking how does it work and what they feel is the risk. And of course, most of our adversaries that are running these campaigns against us are actually doing that because of weakness, not because of the strengths. They just have found a particular weakness in our own societies, but they have more than that. But they have a different authoritarian system in essence. Instead of having a free flow of information, which we in democracies cherish and try to protect, they want to control. So that's what they're trying to do. So what they've, especially after 2011, they've tried to really build the systems that protect them from outside impacts. But what we can see right now, that people within these societies, like Navalny, like the guy who just got arrested, the one that was running Nekta, in the Belarusian guy, they are the ones that really make it really, really painful by just very simple thing, exposing the truth. So I think that's what we have to do. We have to support these kind of people that can expose the realities to the people back in these countries.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really, really good point. And one of the things that I've been trying to point out to military leaders is that what happened to Navalny can happen to any of us in the social media space. We can all be culled from the herd, so to speak, and segregated away. There is no strength in numbers in many ways. We've got about 5 minutes left. And so what I would like to do is to give each of you, a couple minutes to kind of sum up and give us one main takeaway that you would like the conference attendees to kind of remember as they take away from this. And then do you have a book recommendation? So what is one thing that you would recommend that people read to get deeper into what's going on? Dana, if you would start us off.
Yeah. So on the book recommendation, I would recommend the Chris Wiley book that you mentioned earlier. That is the sort of one of the whistleblower stories out of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and really goes into detail about how a lot of the micro-targeting works in a way that I think makes it really accessible. In terms of takeaways, I think one of the things that's been really disheartening to learn over the course of these studies is just how far behind we are in a lot of ways, and the genie is already out of the bottle. And so instead of trying to find ways to put the genie back in the bottle, I think we need to start coming up with other paradigms for what to do going forward. And one of the big things that we've seen coming out of all of this is just how there were these underlying vulnerabilities and rifts in our societies that were just ripe for exploitation, so that, the world is becoming more and more polarized, and our own communities are becoming more and more polarized. Being involved with the pandemic and being stuck at home and relating to people through social media has allowed for us to find these echo chambers and these thought bubbles of being with people who think the same way that we do. And it's amplified a lot of these divisions. Hopefully, as things start to open up and we're doing a little bit more offline, we'll be able to start moving more toward cohesion. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of damage that's already been done. And so part of the solution to these problems in the disinformation and misinformation space really have to do with building social resilience.
Great points. Lydia?
The book I recommend is The Brand Gap by Marty Neumeier. Coming from the marketing background, it comes back to explaining the tribes that Dana was talking about earlier. And we figured that out a long time ago with the marketing. And this is the challenges. We're being divided into tribes. The irony is that the faster we break down the walls of the internet and create more connectivity, the quicker we are building up our own tribes on the internet and building up our walls on the internet. The thing that I wish everybody would take away from this is, if you're not first, you're last, to quote Ricky Bobby from
Talladega Nights.
And the challenge is the Russians are out there. They're out there running the narrative in marketing, in ideas. The first to market, the loudest, the most consistent, that's what gets internalized. I don't feel like we are in there putting our messages out consistently and loudly enough. And we don't have to counter theirs. We have to say what ours are. And on to you.
Jānis, please close us out.
For the military out there, I would recommend, being biased, our own report from NATO CCDCOE, camouflage in the digital domain, which is providing some tips, what can be done for the military to avoid being tracked in the online environment, which might provide some helpful advice. On the big picture, I think there's no time to waste. We are running out of time to fix these things because as we feel all, the system we are having in our countries is starting to wear down.
Yep.
But we have also to be mindful that this is not going to be the end of it. The technology is coming with a new things. And to me, in this digital disinformation domain, I in particular would point to the 5G enabled emergence of Internet of Things that is coupled with the increased spread of augmented reality devices, which in fact will couple the reality and digital reality, which I think will have a very new wave of vulnerabilities, risks, as well as attacks on the human cognitive space. And second, a point of hope. One thing that is great about the democracies, we might be making bad choices, we might probably do mistakes, but it is the only self-correcting system we have. So I'm looking forward to the self-correction that we're going to do all together.
I think that, thank you for leaving us with an element of hope. I think we do have a system that is flawed, but like you said, it is self-correcting. Thank you all panelists for putting the time in to conduct this panel. I hope the audience got a lot of information out of this. And again, thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you.